A messenger walked between two Wall Street back offices on a spring afternoon in 1968, carrying a bundle of engraved paper certificates under his arm. No armored car, no electronic transfer, just a man on foot, moving pieces of paper that represented ownership of a company from one building to another, because that was still the only way a trade could settle. On June 12th of that year, the New York Stock Exchange began closing every Wednesday for the rest of the year. Not because of a crash, not because prices fell. It closed because in 1965, an average of 5 million shares changed hands on the exchange each day, and by 1968 that figure had reached 12 million a day, sometimes spiking past 20 million in a single session. Every one of those shares still moved as a physical certificate, hand-carried, hand-filed, hand-reconciled, by back offices that had not grown to match the volume in front of them. The paper had simply stopped being able to move fast enough to keep up with the trading built on top of it. The exchange's own leadership would later admit the whole system had nearly broken down under the weight of its own success. Brokerage firms tried to answer the flood with mainframe computers, expensive machines that demanded a kind of technical management most partnerships did not have and could not quickly hire. Many of them botched the transition outright, layering half-understood automation onto paper processes that were already failing. The result was a rising tide of what the industry called fails to deliver, trades where the certificate simply never arrived, lost somewhere between a filing cabinet, a courier's bag, and a clerk's desk. The Securities and Exchange Commission tried shortening the trading day in August of 1967 and again in early 1968, hoping fewer hours of trading would let the paperwork catch up. It did not work. The backlog kept growing even as the trading window shrank, because the problem was never the number of hours the market was open. It was the number of pieces of paper still required to move by hand for every single transaction, no matter how few hours were left to move them in. By June of 1968, shortened days were not enough, and the New York Stock Exchange closed its doors entirely every Wednesday, from June 12th through the end of the year. This was not repair, it was triage, a pause built to let back offices dig out from under paper they could not process during 5 trading days, let alone 6. Some employees used the extra day off to golf, according to contemporary newspaper reporting, while others worked through it trying to match certificates to accounts. Then the market itself turned. Volume that had overwhelmed firms on the way up in 1968 reversed and fell through 1969 and 1970, and brokerage revenue fell with it. Firms that had spent 2 years absorbing losses from misplaced certificates, botched computer systems, and unreconciled accounts now faced shrinking income with no cushion left to absorb further damage. By the end of 1970, more than 100 member firms of the New York Stock Exchange had disappeared through merger or liquidation, 1/6 of the entire membership. Goodbody Co. became the marquee case. A single computer failure in 1969 had already cost the firm $7.5 million. By October of 1970, Goodbody's condition became public, and rather than let 225,000 customers risk losing their securities outright, the exchange arranged for Merrill Lynch to absorb the firm, with the merger completed that December. The exchange itself agreed to indemnify Merrill Lynch for up to $30 million in losses tied to the acquisition, funded through special assessments on its own membership. It was only in July of 1971, months after the rescue had already been committed, that the true scale of Goodbody's hidden losses became known. Roughly $24 million, buried inside a firm the exchange had already agreed to protect its rescuer against. That December, with the wider wave of failures already 3 years deep, Congress passed the Securities Investor Protection Act, signed into law by President Nixon on December 30, 1970, creating a fund to cover customers of failed brokerages going forward. The exchange's own president would later write to his membership that the era of the casually managed brokerage firm was finished. Meanwhile, a Securities and Exchange Commissioner would reflect that the entire securities processing system had essentially broken down, with blame split between the back offices themselves and the transfer agents who were supposed to track ownership on their behalf. None of this on its own fixed the underlying problem. Hiring more clerks, buying better filing systems, running paper through faster machines, all of it addressed a symptom. The certificate itself, as a physical object required to move for every single trade, was the actual constraint, and no amount of speed applied to moving paper faster could outrun trading volume that kept climbing. The industry's answer, worked out over the years following the crisis, was not acceleration. It was elimination. Instead of certificates traveling between firms with every trade, a central custodian would take possession of the paper once and hold it there permanently. After that, ownership would no longer change by handing over a certificate at all. It would change by updating an entry in a ledger while the physical paper sat untouched in a vault. This structure became the Depository Trust Company, formed in 1973 directly in response to the paperwork crisis, built specifically to centralize custody of securities and automate the process of settling trades between firms. Alongside it came a nominee entity called Cede and Company, formed to hold legal title to the immobilized certificates on behalf of the depository. The effect was structural, not cosmetic. A share of stock had once meant a specific piece of engraved paper that a person, or their broker, physically possessed. After 1973, for the overwhelming majority of publicly traded shares, that stopped being true. Legal title sat with a nominee that most shareholders had never heard of and would never interact with directly. What an individual investor owned was no longer a certificate at all, but a claim recorded electronically against a chain of book entries, with the actual paper, where it still existed, sitting immobile in a vault, never moving again, regardless of how many times the shares themselves changed hands. A 1973 report by the exchange itself found that 3 out of every 10 investors had experienced lost or late-delivered securities, a number that helps explain why the industry chose immobilization over merely doing the same paper-based process more carefully. The fix was not designed to make certificates move faster. It was designed to make sure they never had to move again. That arrangement did not end with the crisis that produced it. It became the permanent architecture underneath the market. The clearing systems that followed, built through the 1970s and consolidated further in the decades after, all rested on the same basic choice made in 1973. Hold the physical instrument once, and let ownership move only as electronic records afterward. A trade executed today, on a phone or a laptop, settles through descendants of that same depository structure. The brokerage confirms a purchase, a number changes on a screen, and somewhere behind that number the actual mechanics of ownership are being recorded the way they have been recorded since the paperwork crisis forced the industry to stop relying on paper moving by hand. Cede and Company still exists, still holding legal title to immobilized certificates on the depository's behalf, a name that sits on ownership ledgers in place of the people who believe they own the shares. Most shareholders never see that name, never look for it, and never have reason to learn what it represents, because the system was built precisely so that the mechanics underneath a trade would not need to be visible to the person making it. The messenger walking certificates between offices in 1968 was performing an act that, within 5 years, would become almost entirely unnecessary, replaced by a ledger entry sitting behind a nominee's name. There is more than one way to read what actually broke. The historian Wyatt Wells emphasizes volume and technology, firms buying machines they could not run. But the same record supports a second reading, that these were thinly capitalized partnerships with no cushion for error, and that the paperwork merely found the weakness first. Both readings hold. What is not in dispute is where the industry looked for the fix. It did not conclude that clerks were too slow or that partnerships were too small. It concluded that the definition of ownership itself had run into a physical limit, A piece of paper that could only move so fast, held by so many hands, before the entire concept had to be redesigned from the ground up. What replaced it did not eliminate paper because paper was inefficient in some abstract sense. It eliminated paper because paper had already stopped the market once for half a year, one Wednesday at a time. Every trade settled since has moved through that same solution, largely unexamined, under a name most people who trade have never once encountered.